Today we're talking to Matt Glaser. Matt Glaser is a jazz violinist and go-to thought leader in the history of American jazz and roots music, and was featured in the great Ken Burns documentary Jazz. But as a violinist trained at the Eastman School, Matt also has rare insights into the journey that we classical players make as we enter the world of improvisation and creative collaboration. Matt is also director of the American Roots Music Program at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, where he has taught for just decades. And in fact, Matt is responsible for getting me on board to the Berklee College of Music faculty. So, Matt Glaser, it's a huge thrill to talk to you. Can't wait to hear.
It's a thrill to talk to you, Eugene. It's a thrill to hang out with you, and it's great.
Well, I mean, you've made the journey, first of all, from a little kid taking violin lessons into being a great swinging jazz and roots improviser. So, in a nutshell, I mean, how did that go? Were you always interested in like stuff off the page and learning stuff by ear when you were a kid?
Well, let's see. I grew up in a household. My mother was an opera singer. I don't know if you know that. And as my sister and I used to say, she wouldn't swing if you hung her from a chandelier. We used to say about my mother. So I grew up in a household with lots of classical music, and I played classical piano as a kid. I actually started out playing the violin to play folk music. When I was 13 years old, I heard a corn chips commercial on the radio that had a very scratchy fiddle. And I said, that's what I want. So for my 13th...
I can do that.
I don't know if I felt I could do it. I was very attracted to that sound. So my parents got me a violin for my 13th birthday, and I took the subway into Manhattan. We lived in Queens, and I took old-time fiddle lessons. And I must say, I still can't play old-time country fiddle as well as any of the Berklee students that you know so well. Like, they're all incredibly great old-time fiddling prodigies. But that was the sound. And then when I went to my junior high school orchestra teacher, Paul Ehrlich, he said, why don't you play in the orchestra? Even though I couldn't read music on the violin yet. And so I remember the experience of playing Brandenburg concertos. And I I played a Mozart viola quintet with Carter Bray. He and I went to college, high school together.
Carter Bray, the principal cellist
of the New York Philharmonic. He and I went to the same Fischdunkene little high school with a great teacher who really made us fall in love with the music. So I never became even a competent classical violinist, but I loved the music. And I was encouraged by Paul Ehrlich to fall in love with great music, regardless of style. And I feel like that's really been my journey and the journey of a lot of other people, which is to fall in love with music regardless of these boxes that may or may not actually exist. They may not actually exist. Right. They may be marketing terms. Like, for instance, as Darryl often said, Bach had folk dancing in his house, and the world of music that musicians hear is very vast and broad, and I don't think it enters into the ears of a musician based in category. Even within so-called categories of music, they're so vast. Like, if you look at what's called classical music, are we talking about Josquin des Prez or Pachelbel or Schoenberg or Leonard Bernstein or,
I mean, that should be the first question that ever arises when you hear the term classical
what
music.
Is that?
Can you be more specific?
It's so...
Because also, I mean, there are 25 classical musics from different parts of the world,
right.
Not including the subgenres of Western music.
Right. Are we talking about Indian court music or... Turkish court music or every kind
Hindustani wedding music. Yeah. Right.
So vast. So even any one of these styles, jazz is, again, similarly vast. And there's mutual incomprehension between Dixieland jazz people and bebop people and avant-garde people. Sometimes certain kinds of jazz might be more closely connected to certain kinds of classical music. Certain kinds of classical music, like early music, might be more connected to folk styles. You know what I'm saying? That
Yeah, absolutely.
The first thing is
Yeah.
to distrust any words about music, including these words that I'm saying right now.
Kill your tape TV. Oh, that's fantastic. And so it sounds like, I mean, you started playing by ear really before you were comfortable with sheet music.
That's
And so that
absolutely
must
right.
have been a huge
I
plus.
could read on the piano, and I played piano music by eye, but I
Yeah.
learned to play fiddle music by ear.
Yeah, that's great. Why did we lose this? I mean, how did this happen? It's been over 200 years where some of these qualities have not been really featured in our training.
I meant to ask you about this from a cello standpoint because, there were these great romantic violin virtuosos who would write their own cadenzas and were composers, Joachim and Wieniawski and
Yeah, yeah.
Paganini, that whole kind of, so up until the beginning of the 20th century, there were people who were complete musicians doing the whole thing, playing incredible virtuosic stuff, writing their own stuff. Chrysler, all these cats. I don't know what it was like in the world of the cello. Was there similar kind of things going on?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the cello was generally a slightly less versatile solo instrument than the violin was, so that may have been smaller in number. But people like Boccherini,
Boccherini.
you know, I mean, even David Popper, and
Mm,
I mean, there exists today still a lot of kind of etude books by some of these avatars of
mm.
creativity on the cello.
I
But
thought Boccherini was or like Mozart's time or something. Was he later? Was he more romantic?
no, you're right. You're right.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you're talking about specifically in the
No,
Romantic
yeah, I
era?
guess just throughout that
Yeah,
period, throughout those hundreds of years leading up to the beginning of the 20th century. And then
right.
it stopped being a thing. And then it became more, just the way, I guess, like medicine became more specialized. Everything becomes more specialized.
Yeah.
So then you're like, okay, I'm not a composer anymore. I just play the tar out of these pieces, and that's my work.
I
Uh,
I think you put your finger on it. I think that's it. Is because as the competition got greater, and there was a kind of standardization
mm,
of repertoire and training that happened some point in there, along with, and maybe it's for for that very reason that they stopped really featuring the qualities of composition and improvisation by like middle of the 1800s.
hmm.
Yeah, there's a great piano treatise by this wonderful composer Johann Hummel, who actually was a contemporary of Beethoven's,
Mm,
and he wrote this. He was one of the most famous keyboard teachers in Europe,
mm.
and he actually played at Beethoven's funeral.
Wow.
But they were buddies. But he wrote this keyboard treatise, and at the end of it, he encourages people to improvise. He said, "This is a dying art,
Mm,
and when we have to do this, even uses the term free improvisation in this thing." And that was in 1827, I think, when that was published. So what that tells us is that he was already seeing it, disappear
mm,
from pedagogy at that time.
mm.
That is really interesting. But you found your way back, and you found your way back as an American,
Well,
in Brooklyn. Was it Brooklyn?
yeah, I was born in Brooklyn, and then I went, I studied the violin with this guy, Paul Ehrlich, and, I must say, I never really felt connected to most of the mainstream of later classical works. And that sound, like when I would listen to these records of Nathan Milstein and Jascha Heifetz, I think I felt like I really should love this stuff, but I didn't dig it. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really feel that connected to it, and I know I should have. And I appreciated a lot of things about it, but I liked Bach and felt connected to Bach.
Hmm.
But so I struggled as a classical violinist, and I got into the Eastman School of Music on probation by the skin of my teeth. And at the end of the first year, they said, "Thank you very much. You're not good enough to be here. You can
Leave your 8x10 glossy with the secretary. We'll contact you if we need
And
you.
I told my father that I had been excommunicated from Eastman. He said, "That's good because I don't have any more money to send you to college anyway." So I went to college for 1 year at Eastman, dropped out, and that was the end of my classical career at that point. it ended badly for me. Based on my own poor performance level.
It ended badly because you felt some sense of that you hadn't towed the mark in some
Yeah, I
way.
was playing terribly. I was technically the worst violinist at Eastman, and I failed my jury. And the night before my jury, I went out and played bluegrass and got drunk and did terribly the next day. And, but what's interesting is that failure resulted in me having this great career in other
Yeah,
things. So,
yeah, incredible.
many people have stories like this of something that seemed to be bad at the time actually had great positives subsequently. So I dropped out of Eastman and moved to New York City and started playing gigs. This would be 1975 or something like that. I joined a swing band called the Central Park Sheiks. I joined a bluegrass band called the Wretched Refuse String Band. And I was a professional musician in New York, but I kept my connection to classical music because I lived in the house of Carol Glenn and Eugene List. They were a married couple who were like America's sweethearts of classical
Yeah.
music. Eugene List was this virtuoso pianist. Carol Glenn was this virtuoso violinist. And they would rent out rooms in their townhouse to young musicians. And I had a tiny little room. And every morning when I'd come downstairs, Eugene List would be listening to recordings of Art Tatum and Teddy Wilson. He
Really?
loved jazz. He
Wow.
was crazy about jazz. So
Great
we
to
would talk
know.
about jazz. And I mean, this is a guy who was America's most famous classical pianist during World War
Oh,
II.
totally.
And she was lovely. She was a Southern belle, Carol Glenn. And they came to my
Mm-hmm.
gigs sometimes. They would go and come and hear me play. And I was so nervous. So that was my connection to the world of classical music. And I've never turned around subsequently. Um, I've also, I guess I really strongly believe in the incredible value of these worlds of folk music and jazz and
Mm.
uh, all these styles. That's something that's been a through line for me in my life. And as my mother was the classical musician in the family, my father listened to black music of all sorts. Sonny Terry and Brownie McGhee, Mahalia Jackson, Miles Davis, Lester Young with Billie Holiday, on and on. Mississippi John Hurt. He listened to that music and, you know, inculcated in me this love and devotion to American music of all sorts. Um, and
Yeah,
that's something
and
that's my
also an
main.
acceptance
Go
of
ahead.
it because no, and a great acceptance for different genres of music, and not like a snobbish looking down your nose at kind of non-conservatory kind of music.
Oh, and really the opposite. I've always been amazed when people. I remember being in a looking at when I was at Eastman, I was in a record store looking at a Joe Venuti record, and some classical violinist said, "Well, I only play classical music." To me, that kind of mindset was crazy because the existential power of this folk music, it just seemed evident to me that that music was closer to my heart and had incredible value. I wrote my master's thesis on Texas style fiddling, which is this unbelievably highly evolved thing in which the musicians don't talk about it. There's not an intellectual, valise that goes along with the music where they analyze it and talk about it, but it's so deep. They just do it. It's incredibly deep and incredibly developed and complicated, and none of it is expressed in words. It's just the music. And the guys wearing cowboy hats, they're not talking about it. They're just doing it. But when you dig into it, it's like a incredible treasure trove of creative depth and improvisational genius. So to
Along
me,
with tradition.
and a huge tradition handed down from, I wrote my thesis on the great Benny Thomason teaching his young acolyte, Mark O'Connor, and how that became a basis for all kinds of fiddling in America. You can take any style of music and it can become a lifetime's study. Any single so-called style, I think, can be a lifetime's immersion.
Well, and this is a kind of consciousness that you brought to your position at Berklee too, which has been basically encouraging kids to find the music that really turned them on. That you can go as deep as you want to, or as you feel led to with any repertoire.
Yeah.
You're not forced into any box.
That's why you have in your orchestra Kimberly Frazier playing Cape Breton fiddle tunes, grooving like crazy with the orchestra, all these different folk traditions being used as a basis for developing in a chamber orchestra setting. It's really mind-boggling. The Berklee World Strings is
along
really
with along with Michael Jackson and
yeah.
and rap and
yeah.
Iraqi whatever. So
wow.
Yeah, it's a great place at
wow.
Berklee. And in your time there, I mean, you've really escorted a lot of players coming from specific genres into a multitude of different sounds. And are there any generalities you've seen with more classically trained players as they learn to play by ear and kind of play by heart a bit more?
Well, it's funny because I think of different kinds of great classical string players as well as students. Did you know Joel Smirnoff at all when he lived in Boston? Do you know
No,
who that
I
is?
never knew him. No, I'm aware of him. Yeah.
So Joel is this, he was in the Juilliard String Quartet. He was in the Boston Symphony Orchestra, I think, for a while. And now he taught at the Cleveland Concert. One of the great classical violin players. But he came from a family of in which there was great classical string playing and also pop music of all sorts. I think his mother was a big band singer, or maybe his uncle was an arranger. And he would sit in with Tony Bennett. Joel would sit in and play violin with Tony Bennett. And me and Mimi and he were in some early incarnation of the really eclectic string quartet. So,
all right.
And he's at the absolute top. I saw him recently giving lectures in the kind of Dorothy DeLay series. He's as deep as you can go in a classical world, and he also has deep knowledge of these other traditions. So as far as generalities, I think there are, and many people have talked about this more than me, but I think that there are kind of sociological or cultural negative factors in the world of classical string playing that have been observed, that some people are they've been harmed in their own lives by the way that classical string playing, let's say, affected them, and other people have not been harmed by it so much.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like the stylistic thing we were talking about with music, I think you can't make one generality about Western European classical string pedagogy, but there might be some sub areas that are more toxic and other areas that are more open and embracing. Because I know professional string players who've come to me for lessons, a lot of orchestral players in the Boston Symphony and New York Philharmonic, the people have come to me for beginning improv lessons, and they're so screwed up in their head about improvising, and they have so many restrictions, and they're astonishing musicians who I could never hold a candle to in terms of technical skill and everything, but just to ask them to do very simple things in which they're just using their creative mind is very scary to them. And other people, not at all scared by that and totally into it and love it, and it feels very natural to them. So I would ask you the same question. Do you see generalities among the kids at Berklee? I've been at Berklee I'm starting my 43rd year in the fall. Well, you must be in 30-something, right? 38 or something?
24.
24? Really? I worked here for 20 years before I hired you. Well, what was I waiting for? What year did you start working at Berklee?
1999.
Really? Didn't you? You must have come before that and done things.
We did a couple of summer programs prior to that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. What were you doing between 1981 and 1999? Professionally.
Well, I certainly could have been practicing more. I can tell you that. And
Wow.
in fact, the way that I began practicing teaching at Berklee has just been life changing for me.
Interesting.
Uh, oh yeah, I mean, I I had no idea how to really cope with the people that you put in front of me at that point,
Interesting.
including the great Rushad Eggleston.
Hmm.
Fantastic, innovative, improvising cellist, kind of theater act in one. And I really thought that you hired me just to kind of cope with Rushad, basically, because he was a tremendously able, tremendously
Yeah.
capable young artist from the get go, and I learned a lot from him
Hmm.
actually. But in terms of generalities, the basic thing is just how to cross that small little bridge from playing something that you've prepared to playing something that you're really hearing.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that's an incredibly important bridge to cross, but many of us, it just doesn't occur to us
And
until
it's a
someone
one.
kind of gently encourages us.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to tell people is that crossing that bridge happens to all of us on a daily basis. It's not a bridge you cross once. Like
Beautiful.
every
Yeah.
single day, I I have gone back to square one, and like I can't hear intervals and rhythms, and I want to be able to hear intervals and rhythms and play intervals and rhythms that I hear. So I tell people that who study with me, come with me back to square one because it's like doing yoga or something. It's not like you do yoga once. It's like, oh, I exercised once in 1973. I don't need to do it anymore. No, it's a daily practice. So, and it's like using those muscles in a daily kind of way. And so I want to be able to play what I hear, and I cannot yet do that. But that's my lifetime goal, and I find it very gratifying to practice every day, trying to hear a little thing and play a little thing that I hear. Little, like
Great.
within 2 bars. Hearing a rhythm, play that rhythm. Hearing a melody, play that melody. I practice rhythms that I hear just on one string and then on open strings. And I mean, you must have a whole world of exercises about this kind of stuff. Um, but like, I can't play swing rhythms yet. I'm trying to play swing music on the violin. I don't know the full range of rhythms that are used in swing music, nor can I play those rhythms clearly and accurately on the violin. So that's my job. If I want to play that style of music, which I do, I love it. I want to be able to practice the rhythms of swing music, which are vast and beautiful. It's a whole rhythmic language. And I want to be able to execute those rhythms on the violin. The only cat who really could do that was Stuff Smith. There is no other jazz violinist besides Stuff Smith, narrowly defined, because everybody else sounded like some version of a European classical violinist. Whereas Stuff Smith was like, you know what? Prior to Stuff, there had been Western European classical violin and various world folk traditions. And he decided, you know what? I'm going to invent jazz violin. And that means I'm going to just play the language of Louis Armstrong on the violin. Joe Venuti didn't do that. It's not a racial thing because Eddie South didn't do that. Nobody, Stephen Grappelli didn't do that. They all sound great. I knew all these guys, but Stuff Smith was the only cat who really decided to master the rhythmic language of jazz on the violin. So,
Wow.
I practice that way, and I have just stuck my toe in the water about it. You know,
Man, that is so inspiring. Yeah, and it reminds me of kind of a comment that Kenny Werner has in one of his books, which is practice for the effect that it has on your playing.
hmm,
Now, in other words, in this case, we're not practicing specific repertoire that we're going to go out and perform or to record. We're really integrating a kind of feeling and in your case, a passion and curiosity about these things that over a certain amount of time becomes integrated into your playing. And it's nothing specific you're practicing. This is one of the hurdles with a classically trained player when they come to me. They're looking for something very specific that they can learn, to perform. And this is very different.
yeah, for me, I've come to grips with the fact that there's no getting around with the necessity of listening to vast amounts of music and trying to absorb it through your ears.
Yeah.
There's no getting, and to me, if you don't do that, I don't consider you a well-trained musician. No matter what trained seal act you can do technically on your acts, I don't give a fuck about that. To me, you're not, it's like you can recite the dictionary or something. Who cares about that? Have you read Dostoevsky? Have you read Plato? Have you read Leo Tolstoy? Have you read Shakespeare? No? Then you don't know about the riches of human culture. So I want to know about the riches of American music, which to me is one of the great masterpieces of human creativity, is what happened in America in the 20th century musically. And if I don't know about that, I don't know anything. And if I do know about it, then I know something of value. That's why it's very easy for me, and I have to be careful to be dismissive of a lot of things that are popular or people think are so amazing. It's like the quote from Ruby Braff. He said, "If you've never listened to Louis Armstrong, nothing you play is going to be of any interest to me." That's pretty, he was a tough Jewish guy from New York, Ruby Braff. He called it like he saw it. But I understand.
But you've mentioned Louis Armstrong a couple of times now, so it sounds like you consider him to be the real originator of an American sound in jazz.
Well, I'm not alone in that.
I know.
That thought, but
I just wanted to stress it.
Yeah, because there's something, there's video that's been recently repurposed of him in Copenhagen in 1933, and it's interesting. You can hear somebody playing 100 years in the future from where they were at the moment, where you hear what's going to happen 100 years subsequently in that moment. Mm-hmm. Because
like he's planting seeds for the future.
Planting seeds for the future, and you can see the other guys on the stage are like, "Holy shit, I am way out of my depth here. What is going on?" They were like, "Oh wow!" And it reminds me of that quote from Beethoven, where one of his late string quartets, he gave it to a quartet to play, and they said, "We don't understand what you want, what this music is about." And Beethoven said, "It's not for you; it's for the future." Did you ever hear that quote?
Great. I never heard that. Yeah. No, that's good.
The string quartet was like, "We don't understand this." And they said, "Don't worry, It's not for you. It's for the future."
It was absolutely dead right. Dead right.
Have you played Beethoven string quartets?
Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's what made me want to be a musician.
Wow.
Was the string quartet repertoire in general, but particularly the late Beethoven quartets.
Wow.
Yeah, no question.
Do you feel like there's more you can do for classical string players? Are you asking me these questions because you feel like you have more work to do as a teacher for these classical players, or is it more of a rhetorical question?
No, I think that's something you and I share is that we're really interested in teaching this stuff because I'm really interested in learning this stuff.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's my curiosity that makes me practice with the kind of mindset that you're implying. And a desire just to hear more, and I often, talking about styles, I have said the first 1,000 lessons in learning any style is just listening. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have that imprint, inside of you, it's not going to come out.
Wow.
So, yeah. So when you think about the some of the strengths and weaknesses in like American classical training, do you have any insight into that? I mean, what would you say to a teacher, for example, who is teaching kids someplace? How can they round out their curriculum in order to prepare students to really be an American contemporary musician?
Well, I just have to say, in my own, to criticize my own worldview, I'm very aware that I'm not the guy to go to if you want to be, like, if you're interested in, I want to become a gigging musician and I want to master the music business and I want to become successful in the world. that's I don't have answers for that, and I don't claim to prepare people for that. Uh,
I am so disappointed right now because the name of this podcast is How to Make $1 million with a Violin.
but because, and I feel relaxed about it in that I'm Berklee has a mindset to prepare you for a career, make a lot of money, and whether or not that's true, I don't know. I suspect it's not true, but they say it. And but what I believe in and what I try to teach is, um, what I call the path of the musician, which is, and I don't want to get too spiritual about it, but just that I believe in being a musician as a way of life, regardless of the vicissitudes of your career, like whether or not you're successful as a professional musician, like this thing we're talking about of playing simple rhythms and melodies each day or learning to sing things. That kind of life, I think, is valuable until you die, regardless of whether you continue to have gigs or not have gigs. And I think that that's extremely valuable. Like
I,
improvising on a fiddle tune simply by ear, something that anybody could do. You know, here's a simple little fiddle tune. Now just make a few variations in it and try to play those variations, maybe with a metronome on so you feel the time. It's very simple, fundamental musical things that you do on a daily basis are very good for the soul and a good way to live. It's a good way to live. So that to me is
I, I'm really grateful that you brought this up because that is really one of the themes of this website, Beyond Mastery,
mm,
which is not so much about learning to play an instrument,
mm,
but really learning to kind of find your music and what it is that you want to say. What is your sound for? What kind of life do you want to create in music? In other words, a personal practice that is a practice of exploration and discovery and a self-discovery.
and I think it's okay to sound like shit if you want if you do sound like shit. That
I figure that's why I got hired.
it's okay as part of that, you know, if your sound, like
Yeah.
what is your sound? My sound is crappy, but I don't care at all that people are so. You asked about the things that are healthy or not healthy about classical things. I think it'd be so liberating for a lot of classical violin players or cello players to be okay with sounding like shit, um, and not
Yeah.
worry about it because there's,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I don't think it's something to strive for that you sound bad, but you might.
No, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, if I never opened my mouth to express myself because I didn't like the sound of my voice, I mean that's
That's what
what
Pete
you're
Seeger
implying,
famously
right?
said was uh, many people, they don't want to sing because they're afraid they sound bad. And what a mistake that would be to not sing
Mm.
because you're
Mm-hmm.
afraid, that you don't sound good. One time you were talking about these summer programs. One time back in the day when you and I were doing a Berklee summer program, there was this guy. He was like a retired businessman. He had just taken up a viola, I think. He had incredibly limited technique, but and he sounded terrible, but he was so into it and he loved it so much. And he put so much of himself into this thing that he'll never be able to play a gig. Who cares? He had a career as an insurance salesman or something, and he loved the viola. He wanted to play it. He had all kinds of physical problems. I was like, man, I want to be where this guy is at spiritually.
Great. Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
he didn't care at all what people thought. You could see on his face this incredible immersion, deep commitment and love for just the physical act of this and the possibility of playing music. It's really something. Do you remember this cat I'm talking
Great.
about?
Yes, I do. I do. I do.
No,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
because I don't know, not everybody. I mean, there's that whole thing about being a professional musician, and some people are cut out for that kind of a life and other people not. You know, if it's not good for you, don't do it. Who said, like, it's a tough life, and a lot of these kids in the bluegrass world, they love it. Like, there are literally hundreds of kids who've come through Berklee, who I work with, who are now in vans going, pounding the pavement, going from gig to gig to gig. They'll never become millionaires. They love the music. They love traveling around, playing gigs for which they're not paid terribly well, but they can cobble together a living on the circuit of low-paying bluegrass gigs.
But, you know, one aspect of that, which is something that I think you've modeled so beautifully, is this quality of community that they have with each other.
Huge.
And the sense of kind of family.
Huge.
That we don't see that so much in the classical world.
I don't know if you see, it's been very moving. Stash Weisslouch and Marielle Vandersteel's kid is quite sick. I don't know if you followed this.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. These are two wonderful ex-students.
Yeah, Stash Weisslouch, incredible avant-garde bluegrass guitarist, and Marielle Vandersteel, beautiful fiddler, multi-style. Anyway, they have a daughter, I think is a daughter, who has leukemia. And the outpouring of support in this community of musicians has been astonishing to behold. Everybody just rallied.
Oh, that's good to hear. I haven't heard about this. I will reach out. Yeah.
But as you say, the communitarian vibe, that's very strong in this folk music world. Because, I mean, folk music, it's like, you know, that's what you expect.
And it's so uncompetitive, seems to me.
It's certainly very
really
supportive, very cooperative, and very, they have a natural vibe of supporting one another. And
I wonder if it's possible that when you're putting a band together, it's much more important to really choose somebody who you completely vibe with than that may necessarily be the greatest avatar of that, instrument.
Well, it's funny because Stefan Grappelli said to me, he said, if he had had his life to do over again, he wouldn't have worked with Django Reinhardt. He would have chosen to work with someone easier to deal with who was not as gifted.
Wow.
Yeah, he said that to me.
That's amazing.
He said, if I had my life to live over again, I would have gone in a different direction with somebody who was not so impossible.
Incredible. Wow. That's amazing.
I don't know if push came to shove if he would have actually done that. You can always say what if, but that's what he.
Still, it's an interesting little vignette. Something maybe shift topics for a little bit, because something that came up actually in one of our faculty meetings at the Berklee College of Music. We were watching together a clip of I want to say it was like an Iraqi musical group. It was outside someplace, and there's like 6 or 7 people, and someone was playing, I think it was a Comanche, this kind of tiny ethnic cello, and a wonderful string instrument from Turkey, I think originally, or Persia, and we were talking, and this guy was just wailing, when he had his time for a solo, and the parameters of this were rhythmic, but it wasn't complicated rhythmic like South Indian music, and it wasn't really adventurous harmonically either, and so I think it was you who made the point that so much of the world's improvised music is not necessarily a virtuosic, testimony to how well you know harmony or even rhythm to a certain extent. That there is a kind of simplicity that I think for some of us younger improvisers is helpful to remember as we begin to dip our feet into the improvisational pond.
Yeah, I always think of some work that inspired me a lot was the work of the Irish folklorist Micheál O'Sullivan, and he died a few years ago, and he wrote a thesis on the Irish fiddler Tommy Potts. Tommy Potts was a very eccentric guy, and he would improvise on Irish fiddle tunes at a time and in a place where improvising on these tunes was not really, it was very iconoclastic. It was not done very widely.
We're talking about like 50, 75 years ago.
Yeah, and he did it throughout, let's say, the 1960s,
Yeah.
70s, and he was thought of either as a genius or a nut. As George Sell said about Glenn Gould, that nut's a genius. Or maybe he said that genius is a nut. I forget which version of it was. But yeah, so Tommy Potts had his own way of improvising on tunes, Irish fiddle tunes, and he would do it. He would make subtle changes in little melodic passages, and so you really got to look. This is where stylistic differentiation comes in handy, because all of these different styles have subtle different approaches to these different issues. The balance of elements always changes. But I don't know about the rhythmic. I don't know that I would totally agree with you about the rhythmic part, but I would agree with you about the harmonic part. There's all these musics in the world that don't have chords as we think of them, don't have harmony as you and I would think of harmony, as Western Europeans think of harmony, as Americans think of harmony. So classical Indian music, any music against the drone, various kinds of folk music of which there's a lot, where there's like a melody and rhythm, and that's it pretty much. So there's all kinds of great music in the world, incredible music, Turkish classical music, all kinds of music that has no chords. So it teaches people then to think about improvising on scale systems, on just the core elements of the melody, on rhythmic things, and not be oppressed by chords as one would be oppressed at the chord factory, which is what they call Berklee. So,
well, that's exactly why I asked that question, because I think for many of us, when we think of improvising, we can't help but think of the great, improvisers, Bird, John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie, people who just like burn every time they reinvent their instrument, every time they pick it up, and over all kinds of melodic innovations and extensions of chords and stuff like that. And we think that if we can't do that, then we shouldn't even open our mouth.
Well, it's interesting because the earlier parts of jazz that I'm more and more interested in are less about the chords. Like somebody like Lester Young was really an incredible genius, because he said once he didn't like it when people at a jam session would shout out the chords, because he said that might restrict me. If I start thinking about the chords, I want to use my ears and play what I hear. And he was able to hear beautiful things that work. What's really astonishing about some Lester Young solos is if you play them, if you don't know the chords to the song, they're beautiful melodies by themselves, but they also happen to fit beautifully over these chords, as opposed to reciting the chords or being overly oppressed by the chord changes. He figured out a way to play, and it's true for Louis Armstrong and a lot of early jazz guys, Bix Beiderbecke. They're less about, they were aware of the harmony, and the harmony that's being used is less upper structure kind of stuff. So it's good for folk musicians who are getting into jazz to work on these earlier jazz styles. If they don't want, or even classical musicians too, if you don't want to think too much about chords, you can learn some earlier jazz things that have rhythms of swing music. They're beautiful.
That's great. That is great info. And kind of along that lines, I was able to do a recording session with the great Toots Thielemans.
Oh my God.
The great Belgian chromatic harp player. And part of that session, he was instructed by the producer to listen to 5 improvised solos that he had recorded like a previous day.
Wow.
And to select one for this tune. Yeah. and I went in the control room I listened to like 6 solos.
Wow.
They were all just epically
Yeah.
fantastic, you know. And I said, Toots, I mean, how do you decide,
Wow.
you know? And he didn't answer that question, but he said, yeah, I may not know my chords, but I sure know my notes. I've been thinking about that for 30
That
years.
is amazing. Wow.
Such a fantastic
Yeah,
comment.
you got to be able to really master intervals. There's no getting around that. I have a lot of work to do with
relationships.
That. You know,
Yeah, me
that's
too.
you know, I remember Lauren Schoenberg, who's the artistic director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem. I was singing a Lester Young solo to him, and he said, "You really have to nail the intervals." And I've been thinking about that for years and that's aspirational for me still to this day, really hearing intervals properly. Yeah.
I mean, so much of improvising is about ear training, actually, isn't it?
Wow. Yeah. Incredible.